The small town of San Isidro was nestled between rolling hills and vast stretches of farmland, where the sun always seemed to cast a golden glow over the tiled rooftops. Dust swirled gently outside as Hermana Camilla, dressed in her pristine white habit, sat across from Don Mateo, the aging principal of Escuela Primaria San Isidro. The wooden office smelled of old books, ink, and the faint scent of coffee, a comforting atmosphere that reminded her of the convent she had just left behind. Don Mateo, a stocky man with graying hair and a kind but weathered face, smiled warmly at her. "Hermana Camila, we are honored to have you here. The children will benefit greatly from your guidance." Camilla folded her hands neatly on her lap and nodded with a soft smile. "Thank you, Señor Mateo. It is a blessing to serve here." The principal exhaled and leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "I hope you find everything to your liking. San Isidro is a peaceful town, but—" He paused before continuing, choosing his words carefully. "You should be careful with your belongings. Theft has become a bit of a problem." Camilla's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh?" He nodded. "Especially for newcomers like yourself. The past 3 years have seen a rise in stolen goods, tools, livestock, even clothes from wash lines. People have their suspicions, but no one can ever prove anything." Camilla smiled, thinking nothing of it. "I appreciate the warning, Señor Mateo, but I have little to steal." He chuckled. "Even so, better safe than sorry." Later that morning, Camilla stood in front of her new class, chalk in hand, writing simple arithmetic problems on the board. The classroom was small but full of eager young faces, their desks neatly arranged in rows. Sunlight streamed through the open window, and outside, she could hear the distant chatter of merchants setting up in the plaza. Knock, knock. A soft but firm tap on the open door. Camilla turned, only half paying attention at first. "Good morning." The voice was smooth, confident. Camilla turned fully now, her gaze falling on a young woman leaning casually against the doorframe. She was unlike anyone Camilla had encountered before. Her jet-black pixie cut framed sharp, striking features. A thin silver chain hung around her neck, barely visible beneath the collar of her loose white button-up shirt, unbuttoned just enough to hint at rebellion. Her black leather trousers clung effortlessly to her long legs, and the worn boots on her feet suggested she had seen more of the world than most in San Isidro. Camilla felt an immediate wave of disapproval. The woman, however, barely seemed to notice. Or maybe she did, and simply didn't care. She lifted a small, dented lunchbox, extending it toward Camilla with a smirk. My baby brother. He forgot his lunchbox." Camilla blinked, slowly processing her presence. She turned her gaze toward the back of the room, where a timid-looking boy sat near the window, his small frame hunched as he stared at his desk. Camilla turned back to the woman, her fingers hesitating before she took the lunchbox as though it might be contaminated. The woman caught on immediately. Her smirk disappeared, replaced by an expression that was hard to read, something between amusement and offense. "I beg your pardon?" she snapped. Camilla straightened. The lunchbox is for who?" The woman exhaled sharply through her nose, then pointed again. "For Emiliano. Right there." The boy by the window hesitated before timidly raising his hand. Camilla gave him a small nod before accepting the lunchbox fully. "Okay." The woman tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as she studied Camilla. Then, suddenly, she scoffed. "You're welcome to our town, Hermana. I hope you last a week here with that holier-than-thou attitude of yours." Camilla's lips parted slightly, caught off guard. Before she could say anything, the woman turned on her heel and walked away, boots clicking lightly on the tiled floor as she exited without looking back. Camilla stared after her, clutching the lunchbox a little too tightly. She couldn't quite place what it was about this woman, this reckless-looking woman, But one thing was certain. She made Camilla uncomfortable in a way she had never felt before. The town of San Isidro had always been small, but for Valeria Duarte, it had never felt that way. To her, it was vast, unkind, and filled with hungry mouths and hollow promises. She had learned from an early age that in this town, people like her were meant to endure, not to dream. Valeria was only 16 when she became the sole provider for her baby brother, Emiliano. Their parents had died 6 years ago, victims of a senseless roadside ambush when a group of bandits had attacked the wagon they were traveling in. Their deaths had left her with nothing but a fragile, wide-eyed 2-year-old to care for and a lifetime of uncertainty ahead of her. There was no time to grieve, no time to be a child, no time for anyone to care what happened to a pair of orphaned siblings in a town that barely had enough for itself. By the time she turned 16, she was already working, doing whatever she could to keep them alive. Her first real job had been at Hacienda Montenegro, the largest estate in town, a sprawling piece of land owned by Don Alejandro Montenegro, a ruthless and wealthy landowner whose family had ruled over San Isidro for generations. The estate was a grand, unforgiving place, filled with well-fed horses, endless vineyards, and walls so high they seemed to touch the sky. Inside those walls, life was different: gold and silk, opulence and abundance. While outside, families like Valeria's fought for scraps. Valeria had worked in the stables, tending to the Montenegro family's prized horses, ensuring they were well fed, groomed, and ready for their rich owners to ride whenever they pleased. It was back-breaking work, but it paid just enough for a place to sleep and something to eat. The estate had many servants, mostly young, desperate people like her, with nowhere else to go. They were housed in small, cramped quarters at the edge of the estate. Dormitories meant to keep the workers close but separate from the grandeur of the main house. Valeria and Emiliano had lived there, sharing a tiny room with nothing but a rickety bed and a flickering candle to light the dark nights. But misery loves company, and it was in that cold, lonely place that Valeria had found warmth. Her name was Isabella, and she was 17, just a year older than Valeria. She had come to the estate the same way Valeria had, orphaned, desperate, and willing to do anything to survive. She worked in the Montenegro household, scrubbing floors and serving meals to the family that never bothered to learn her name. Valeria and Isabella had met by chance, stealing a moment of rest in the shadows of the stables, both too exhausted to move, too broken to care about the rules. At first, they spoke little, just quiet glances and the occasional exchange of stolen bread when one had a little extra. But then, something shifted, something deep, unspoken. One night, in the servants' quarters, while Emiliano lay fast asleep beside them, Isabella had reached for Valeria's hand under the threadbare blanket they shared for warmth. It was the first time Valeria had ever felt wanted. What followed was a wildfire. Passionate, desperate, reckless. They were everywhere. The gardens, the stables, the darkened corners of the estate where no one bothered to look. They worshipped each other in silence, their bodies entwining like vines, finding solace in the only thing they could truly call their own: each other. But San Isidro was not kind to lovers like them. It was no surprise when, one afternoon, as they lay tangled together in the grass, hidden behind rows of apple trees, one of Don Alejandro's daughters stumbled upon them. The girl had shrieked as though she had witnessed the devil himself, dropping the basket of apples she had been carrying. The news spread like wildfire. By nightfall, they were summoned before the estate's overseer, a cruel man who barely even looked them in the eye as he informed them that they were no longer welcome. "Perverts like you don't belong here." That was it. Their entire world, 3 years of sweat, pain, and sacrifice, was thrown away in an instant. But Valeria and Isabella had made a choice before they left. They would not walk away empty-handed. On their final night at the estate, under the cover of darkness, they crept into the main house, into the Montenegro family's private chambers, and took whatever they could carry. Jewelry, golden rings, pearl necklaces, silver trinkets, anything that could be sold. It wasn't just revenge, it was survival. By dawn, they were gone. Valeria took Emiliano and left the estate forever, never once looking back. With what little they had stolen, they rented a small, run-down apartment at the edge of town, a place where no one asked questions and no one cared who you were. It wasn't much, but for the first time in her life, Valeria could breathe. She had money, freedom, and Isabella. For a moment, she believed they could build something real. But nothing in San Isidro lasted forever. They had lived together for almost a year, their love still burning just as fiercely, but the cracks had already begun to show. Valeria had always been wild, but Isabella had been restless. She wanted more than stolen jewelry and hiding in the shadows. She wanted to leave San Isidro entirely, to find a place where they didn't have to live in fear. Valeria refused. "This is our home," she had said. "We can survive here." But Isabella didn't want to just survive. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Isabella had packed her things and left, walking out of Valeria's life without looking back. Valeria had stood at the doorway, watching her go, unable to move, unable to speak. She never saw her again. And now, years later, the only thing that remained of that life was Emiliano, the only person who had never left her, the only thing that mattered. She would die before she let anything happen to him. So when she had walked into that classroom earlier that morning, finding a nun of all people looking down on her, treating her like she was filth, something in her had snapped. She had wanted to shake that self-righteous woman, to tell her she had no idea what it took to survive in this town. But she hadn't. Instead, she had laughed, thrown a parting jab, and walked away, letting the nun choke on her own judgment. Still, as Valeria walked back home that afternoon, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something about Hermana Camila had gotten under her skin. And that annoyed her more than anything else. The days in San Isidro were long and predictable, each one blending into the next like the golden hues of the fields at sunset. Camilla had settled into the rhythm of the school, teaching her students with patience, learning their names, their quirks, their struggles. But one thing she had not settled into, one thing that refused to leave her in peace, was Valeria Duarte. She didn't want to think about her, didn't want to remember the sharpness in her eyes, the reckless confidence, the way she scoffed like she had the world figured out. And yet, Camilla caught herself doing just that. She had spent far too long clutching that dented lunchbox, her fingers tightening around the metal until the warmth of Valeria's touch had long faded. She had spent far too long thinking about the way that woman had looked at her, like she was nothing more than another judgmental face in a town full of them. Maybe she was. She hated the thought. Camilla exhaled and focused on the task at hand, dipping a cloth into a basin of water and wiping the dust off the wooden desks. She stayed behind after class to clean, something she had done back at the convent, finding comfort in the repetitive motion, the silence, the stillness. But today, she wasn't alone. From the back of the classroom, Emiliano fidgeted. He had been quiet all day, even quieter than usual. The boy was always reserved, keeping to himself. But today, there was a weight on his small shoulders, something that made Camilla take notice. "Emiliano?" She set the cloth aside and approached his desk. He flinched. That was unusual. Her brow furrowed. "Is something wrong?" He didn't answer. Instead, he hunched lower in his seat, fingers gripping the edge of the desk. Camilla crouched beside him, softening her voice. "You can tell me. Still nothing. But before she could press further, she noticed the edge of a bruise peeking out from under his shirt collar. Her breath caught. "Emiliano," she whispered, but he jerked away, his wide, fearful eyes meeting hers for the first time. And that's when she knew. Something was very wrong. Camilla found Valeria at dusk. She hadn't meant to go looking for her, hadn't even known where to start, but her feet carried her through the winding streets of San Isidro until she stood outside a modest little home on the outskirts of town. The door was open, warm light spilling onto the dirt path. Camilla hesitated. She had no business being here. And yet, she stepped forward. Inside, the air smelled of spiced beans and corn, and the low flicker of a candle illuminated the small space. It was simple, lived in. On a rickety wooden table, a deck of cards sat half-played, as though someone had been in the middle of a game. And then, there she was. Valeria. She stood by the open window, back to the door, rolling a cigarette between her fingers. She hadn't noticed Camilla yet, but Emiliano had. The boy's face paled as he sat on the edge of a worn couch, eyes darting between the nun and his sister. Camilla cleared her throat. Valeria turned, and the moment their eyes met, her expression hardened. Valeria's eyes flashed, but just as she stepped forward, Camilla did the same. And that's when it happened. A brush, barely there, the ghost of a touch. Her fingers grazing Valeria's forearm as they moved at the same time. Not even a full second. But it was enough. Enough for Valeria's breath to catch, just slightly, just enough to be noticed. Enough for Camilla to feel it. Warm skin, calloused but steady, a stark contrast to her own. They both froze. Neither of them spoke. For the briefest of moments, they just stared. Valeria's lips parted, like she might say something, but she didn't. Instead, she swallowed, pulling back first, just a fraction. The candlelight flickered between them, but it couldn't touch the space that now felt charged. Camilla's own hand tingled as she let it fall back to her side. Neither of them acknowledged it. "What the hell are you doing here?" Camilla squared her shoulders. "We need to talk." "No, we don't." Emiliano came to school today with a bruise. Valeria stilled. For a fraction of a second, she didn't react. Didn't even blink. Then, a slow exhale. A scoff. She leaned against the doorway, crossing her arms. "So?" Camilla frowned. "So I need to know if he's safe." Valeria laughed at that. Not the kind that carried humor, the kind that carried disbelief. "You think I'd let something happen to him?" "I don't know," Camilla admitted. "That's why I'm here." Camilla searched her face, looking for an answer, but Valeria had already put her walls back up. "This is the last time you come here, sister." Camilla hesitated. For the first time since arriving in San Isidro, she wasn't sure what to say. She turned, stepping back into the night. But even as she walked away, even as she put distance between them, she could still feel it. That brief, fleeting moment of contact lingering on her skin like something impossible to forget. And that unsettled her more than anything else. Valeria had long since learned that the past was never truly buried. It waited, silent, patient, until the right moment to resurface and sink its teeth into her throat. That moment came 2 nights ago. It had started with a knock at the door. A single, sharp rap. Not frantic, not desperate, deliberate. Valeria had been sitting at the rickety wooden table, counting the last of their money under the dim candlelight while Emiliano played quietly with a deck of old, bent cards. The knock made her stomach twist. She knew before she even got up. Knew before she reached for the knife hidden under the table. Before she pressed her ear to the door and heard them. She opened it anyway, because she had no choice. 2 men stood in the doorway, Eduardo and Rigo. They were dressed like ordinary farmhands, dusty shirts, worn boots. But Valeria wasn't fooled. She knew exactly what they were. Leeches. Their faces were carved with the kind of greed that only grew sharper with time, their eyes scanning the tiny space behind her, looking, searching, as if they already owned everything inside. Eduardo, the taller of the two, grinned, revealing a gold tooth that glinted in the candlelight. "Hola, Valeria." Her grip on the knife tightened. "You're not welcome here." Eduardo chuckled. "That's funny because I seem to remember you welcoming us just fine when you and Isabella took something that didn't belong to you." Valeria's blood turned to ice. Rigo, the shorter one, stepped forward, his thick fingers tapping against the doorframe. "Where is she, by the way?" "Isabella." His smirk was slow, cruel. "I heard she left. What a shame. You two made such a pretty little pair." Valeria didn't move. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Eduardo clicked his tongue, stepping inside without an invitation. "You know, we've been patient. We let you live your little life. But the thing about stolen money, Valeria..." He leaned in, voice dropping into something dangerous. "It never really belongs to you." She swallowed. "We had a deal." Eduardo smiled, wide and mocking. "And now we're making a new one." Rigo shut the door behind him. The small space suddenly felt smaller. Emiliano had gone stiff on the couch, his small hands gripping the edge of his seat. His wide eyes darted between the men and his sister. Valeria turned slightly, voice low, warning. "Go to bed, Emiliano." The boy didn't move. Eduardo noticed, his grin stretching wider. "Oh, don't be shy, kid. We're just talking to your sister." Valeria's heart pounded. This was different. Before, they had been predictable, greedy, but not reckless. But something had changed. They weren't just here for money. They were here to remind her. Rigo stepped closer. Too close, his thick fingers grazing the edge of her jaw as he tugged at a stray curl near her ear. Valeria slapped his hand away, jaw tight. "Don't!" Eduardo laughed. Rigo's smile didn't falter. "Relax, Hermosa. We're all friends here." Her stomach churned. "I don't have anything left." Eduardo sighed, feigning disappointment. "Now that is very unfortunate." Then, before she could react, a fist buried into her stomach. Valeria staggered back, gasping as white-hot pain shot through her ribs. "Valeria!" Emiliano leapt forward, but Eduardo was faster. He grabbed the boy roughly by the arm and shoved him hard against the table. The crack of impact echoed through the small room. Emiliano yelped. Valeria's vision blurred with rage. She lunged, but Rigo caught her by the wrist, twisting her arm sharply behind her back. Eduardo leaned down toward Emiliano, voice almost gentle. "Now, that was foolish." The boy whimpered, clutching his shoulder, blinking back tears. Valeria thrashed, but Rigo's grip only tightened, his breath hot against her ear. "Money," Eduardo said simply. "Now." She knew when she was beaten. Gritting her teeth, she jerked her chin toward the corner of the room. "My coat! Inside pocket." Eduardo strolled over, whistling as he dug through the fabric. Then, he found it. The last of her earnings. The last of everything. He counted the bills, smirked, and tucked them into his coat. "That's a good girl." Valeria didn't speak. She couldn't. Rigo finally let her go, shoving her forward as Eduardo patted Emiliano's head mockingly. "See? No harm done." Valeria barely held back a snarl. Eduardo grinned. "Be seeing you, Valeria." And just like that, they were gone. The door slammed shut, leaving behind silence. Valeria exhaled shakily, turning to Emiliano. He was still on the floor, his face twisted in pain, his tiny hands trembling. She fell to her knees beside him, reaching out, pausing when he flinched. Her stomach dropped. She touched his shoulder gently, voice barely above a whisper. "Did they hurt you?" Emiliano sniffled. Valeria felt something inside her break. She should have left. She should have gone with Isabella when she had the chance. But she had been stubborn. Now? Now, they had nothing. And for the first time in years, Valeria Duarte felt fear. Camila knew something was wrong the second she saw him. Emiliano sat at the edge of the schoolyard, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, his face buried against them. She didn't hesitate. She crossed the yard in 3 quick strides, crouching in front of him, heart hammering. "Emiliano?" The boy didn't look up, but when he sniffled, when he wiped at his face with his sleeve, she knew. Something terrible had happened. She reached out, voice softer. "What is it?" Emiliano cracked. Tears spilled over as he whispered, voice broken. "We got thrown out." Camilla's breath caught. He hiccuped through his words. "The landlord came this morning. We didn't have enough for rent. He told us to leave." Camilla's stomach twisted. She stood up immediately. "Where is Valeria?" The boy sniffled, rubbing his eyes. "She went to see someone at the chapel." Heavy thunder rumbled overhead. The sky was dark, thick with storm clouds. Camilla stood beside Emiliano at the chapel's entrance, arms crossed. Then, the doors opened. Valeria stepped out. Her usual curt expression was in place, her jaw set, her shoulders squared. But Camilla noticed the exhaustion, the weariness lurking beneath the surface. Valeria's eyes flicked between them, her brow raising slightly. Camilla tilted her head. "So, I heard you both are looking for a home to stay in?" Valeria's lips parted. Then, a loud crack of thunder split the sky. And just like that, the storm began. The trio ran as fast as their legs could carry them as the rain poured heavily, drenching their bodies until they got to the nuns' modest 1-bedroom home. The small house was simple but cozy, just a humble living room with a small TV, a wooden table, and a couch that could extend into a bed. It smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a scent that seemed to belong to Camilla herself. Valeria exhaled sharply, running a hand through her dripping hair as she took in the space. The room was warm, despite their wet clothes clinging to their skin. "Emiliano and me will take the couch, Hermana," Valeria said quickly, noticing the way Camilla hesitated. The nun opened her mouth to argue. "No, it's fine. You are too—" "No way, Hermana," Valeria interrupted, shaking her head. "And don't worry. This is just for the night, max 2 days. I'll find something to do, and we'll be out of your space." She spoke without thinking, the weight of their situation still pressing down on her. It didn't sit right, taking charity, especially from a woman who had judged her just about a week ago. But she couldn't afford pride right now. Camilla studied her for a moment, then offered a small smile. "I'm not bothered. You two can stay as long as you need until you get back on your feet." Valeria swallowed. She wasn't sure why that made her feel something strange in her chest, something close to gratitude, something she wasn't used to. Before she could say anything, Camilla turned to Emiliano, who was shivering beside her. "Emiliano, let's get you in the bathtub," the nun said gently before looking at Valeria. "Help him out of those wet clothes." Valeria nodded, guiding Emiliano toward the tiny bathroom, grateful for the distraction. It didn't take long before the boy was bathed and dressed in one of Camilla's oversized shirts, his small frame swallowed up by the fabric. He yawned, exhaustion catching up to him, and within minutes, he was curled up on the couch, already half asleep. Camilla, meanwhile, sat on the couch, her rosary clutched in her hands, murmuring silent prayers as she waited for Valeria to finish bathing. She had changed into something lighter, just a simple white cotton nightgown. But her body itched from the lingering dampness. She needed to wash the rain away, but first, she had to wait for Valeria. Valeria took her time in the bathroom, letting the hot water run over her skin, easing the tension that had knotted her muscles for days. She barely noticed how long she stood under the stream, her fingers braced against the cool tiles. The weight of everything, the eviction, the fear, the storm, pressed down on her. But for once, the warm water dulled it, if only slightly. Outside, Camilla remained seated on the couch, her rosary slipping between her fingers, her prayers steady but unfocused. She had expected exhaustion to overtake her, but sleep was the last thing on her mind. The house was small, smaller than she was used to, but somehow it felt suffocating now in a way it hadn't before. Perhaps it was because of the woman in the bathroom. She exhaled, shaking off the thought, squeezing her eyes shut as she tried to focus. But when the bathroom door creaked open, the sound was impossible to ignore. A waft of steam escaped into the room, curling at the edges of the dim candlelight. Camilla kept her gaze down, forcing herself to continue her prayers, forcing herself to keep her mind pure. Then she heard it. A small, muffled curse, and then a soft thud. Her eyes snapped open, her rosary still clutched between her fingers as she instinctively turned toward the sound. And froze. Valeria stood in the doorway, completely bare. Her towel pooled at her feet, having slipped from her grasp the moment she stepped out. For a second, just a second, she didn't react. Neither of them did. Time stretched impossibly thin. Camilla's breath hitched, her pulse hammering violently in her throat as her eyes registered the sight before her. Valeria's skin was still damp, glistening slightly in the dim glow of the room, her dark hair curling at the edges from the lingering moisture. She moved in an instant, snatching the towel off the floor and clutching it to her body, her own breath catching as realization struck. Camilla had seen everything. "Madre de Dios," Camilla whispered, her face going up in flames as she looked away so quickly she nearly made herself dizzy. Valeria's jaw clenched, her heart pounding. Neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick, too thick. Camilla swallowed hard, gripping her rosary like it might save her from whatever this was. "This," she whispered under her breath, barely audible but heavy with meaning, "is going to be a very bad decision letting this woman stay here." She could feel Valeria's gaze lingering on her, searching, knowing, but neither of them acknowledged what had just happened. They couldn't. Not yet. Did that ending leave you wanting more? If you want part 2, make sure to like this video and drop a comment below. Tell me your thoughts. What do you think will happen next? And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Your support helps bring more thrilling tales to life.